Richard B. Spencer in November 2016 in Washington. The anti-immigration group he leads was told it could not hold its annual conference at a federal office building in the Capitol. DragoThe New York Times, Washington. An anti-immigrant group led by the white nationalist Richard B. Spencer was told on Thursday that it could not hold its annual conference in a federal office building, just blocks from the White House, because of security concerns raised by the building's management company. The decision prompted new questions over when, and how, nativist groups are allowed to speak in public spaces. Mr. Spencer is the president of the National Policy Institute, which promotes itself as a research and educational foundation. It had planned to hold its meeting on November 19 at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center in downtown Washington, where the conference took place last year. Mr. Spencer, who lives in the Washington area, did not respond to a request for comment on Thursday. He told The Washington Post that he was shocked when he learned that the building turned down his request to use its space, saying that it seemed to be a First Amendment issue. It is not the first time Mr. Spencer's group has asked to hold an event on public property, or, at least, in places that receive federal funds, and been turned away. But it underscores the simmering debate over giving ground for Mr. Spencer and his following to gather. Michigan State University, Ohio State University and Pennsylvania State University have all recently denied Mr. Spencer the space to speak on campus. But he was permitted to book a speaking venue last month at the University of Florida, though it led to a campus-wide outcry and a state of emergency declaration by Rick Scott, the Florida governor. The right to reserve event space at the Reagan Building comes with its own idiosyncrasies. Owned by the General Services Administration, it is the first and only federal building dedicated to government and private use. The Reagan Building is operated by Trade Center Management Associates, a private firm that oversees event spaces in the sprawling complex. Deborah Cope, a spokeswoman for the management group, said the Reagan Building is unique in that it is a public-private partnership that operates differently from other federal buildings. In a statement, a General Services Administration spokeswoman said that the agency does not have the authority to consider requests to hold events in the part of the building that Mr. Spencer sought to reserve. The building management's misgivings are partly a response to last year's conference, which drew hundreds of protesters and required dozens of police officers to control the crowd. Ms. Cope described violent incidents, arrests and threats to building employees during that protest, and noted that the building was damaged in some places. Additionally, she said, Mr. Spencer's meeting and the protests against it disrupted another event in the building that was taking place at the same time. Last year's commotion did not deter Mr. Spencer's plans to return to the site for this year's annual meeting. In August, he urged supporters to join us in Washington in an email promoting the conference at the Reagan Building. That same month, Mr. Spencer was a keynote speaker at a white nationalist march in Charlottesville, VA, to protest the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee in a city park. A 32-year-old woman, Heather Dehere, was killed when one of the protesters plowed his car into a crowd of people who were holding a counter-demonstration against the white nationalists. The Reagan Building management said in a statement that it rejected Mr. Spencer's application in part because of the National Policy Institute's participation in the Charlottesville protests. Mr. Spencer may have a valid complaint about being barred from speaking in a space owned by the government, said Laura Beth Nielsen, a professor at Northwestern University and a research professor at the American Bar Foundation. But, she said, that does not mean he has a winning case. One thing most people don't know: the First Amendment only prohibits the government from restricting your speech, said Ms. Nielsen, who specializes in matters of hate speech and First Amendment rights. The question is, how do you think about the kind of speech that might pose a threat of violence? Whose obligation is it to secure the space? The government can restrict speech when they think the person is going to incite lawless activity, she added. It's not just that it can. It might be obligated to. Thursday's decision could hint at a more theatrical standoff between Mr. Spencer and the federal government in the future, especially if taxpayers have to pay the bill for the police and other security forces to keep his events under control. Of course, the state can't stop that person from speaking, Ms. Nielsen said. But what's our financial and moral obligation to give that speech a platform when it would be really expensive to do that safely?